Throughout history, there have been athletes so dominant, so fierce, that they didn't just defeat their opponents. They struck fear into their hearts. We're not talking about your everyday champions here. These are the warriors who made their rivals pray they wouldn't have to face them. The kind of athletes who changed their sports forever, leaving behind trails of broken records, and sometimes broken bodies. From a boxer who literally had to handicap himself to get fights, to a fighter whose opponents would rather fake injuries than face him. These are the 15 most dangerous athletes to ever step into the arena. And trust me, by the time we reach number 1, you'll understand why some legends aren't just made, they're feared. How's that for our opening? It establishes the tone, builds anticipation, and gives viewers a taste of what's coming without revealing too much. Would you like me to adjust anything about the style or content? Number 15, Francis Ngannou. Listen, when people talk about raw power in combat sports, one name sends shivers down everyone's spine. Francis Ngannou. Imagine hitting something with the force of a Ford Escort, going at top speed. That's what it feels like to get punched by this man. And no, that's not just some random comparison, that's actual science. The UFC's Performance Institute measured his punch at 129,161 units, the hardest punch ever recorded. Born in Cameroon and starting life as a sand miner, Ngannou's story reads like something out of a movie. But here's what makes him truly dangerous. In a sport where fighters train their whole lives, this guy walked into MMA at 26 and started putting elite heavyweights to sleep like he was flipping a light switch. We're talking about a man who made Alistair Overeem, one of the most experienced fighters in the game, look like he got hit by a sniper rifle. But what really keeps other fighters awake at night isn't just his power, it's how much he keeps evolving. Remember that fight against Stipe Miocic? The one where everyone said he'd gas out? Well, 5 rounds later, he was still throwing bombs that could knock out a buffalo. If you're wondering what pure concentrated danger looks like in human form, just watch any Ngannou highlight reel. If you can handle watching grown men fall like they've been unplugged from the Matrix. Number 14, Alexander Karelin. Ever heard of the Russian bear? No, we're not talking about some fairy tale. We're talking about Alexander Karelin, arguably the most dominant athlete in any sport ever. Picture this. For 13 years straight, this man didn't just win matches. He didn't even give up a single point. Let that sink in. Not 1 point. Karelin wasn't just a wrestler. He was a force of nature in a singlet. His signature move? Something called the Karelin lift, where he'd pick up 290-pound men like they were grocery bags and throw them through the air. These weren't amateurs either. These were Olympic-level wrestlers who spent their whole lives learning how not to get thrown. Didn't matter to Karelin. Here's the really scary part, his training routine. He'd run up mountains in Siberia carrying tree trunks on his shoulders. When normal workouts got too easy, he'd wrestle multiple fresh opponents one after another. The guy was so intimidating that opponents would literally forfeit matches just seeing him warm up. From 1987 to 2000, this man lost exactly 1 match, and that loss? It came in his final Olympic appearance, by a single point, in a match that's still debated today. Think about that. The only thing that could beat the Russian bear was retirement. Number 13, Roberto Duran. They called him Manos de Piedra, hands of stone. But Roberto Duran wasn't dangerous because of his punching power alone. No, what made this Panamanian legend truly terrifying was what he'd do to your soul before his fists even touched you. Duran didn't just beat opponents, he broke them mentally. He'd stalk them around the ring like a predator playing with its food. He'd talk to them, mock them, and make them feel like prey before unleashing combinations that felt like getting hit with a bag of hammers. And he did this across 4 weight classes, in an era when boxing was at its peak. But here's what makes Duran truly one of the most dangerous athletes ever. He'd take the thing you were best at and make you afraid to use it. Sugar Ray Leonard was the golden boy of boxing, the fastest hands in the sport. In their first fight, Duran made him so scared to throw punches that Leonard completely abandoned his style. Imagine being so intimidating that you make an Olympic gold medalist forget how to box. The craziest part? Duran started fighting grown men in illegal street fights when he was just 8 years old. By the time he got into professional boxing, he'd already been terrorizing people for over a decade. With 103 wins in his career, 70 by knockout, Duran wasn't just dangerous, he was a force of nature wrapped in boxing gloves. Number 12. Khabib Nurmagomedov. In the world of mixed martial arts, being undefeated doesn't just mean winning, it means surviving every single war you've ever been in. And nobody did it quite like Khabib Nurmagomedov. 29 fights, 29 victories, and not even a close call among them. But what makes this Russian warrior truly dangerous isn't just his perfect record, it's how he dominated some of the most dangerous fighters on the planet. Imagine training your whole life in striking, wrestling, and jiu-jitsu, becoming one of the best fighters in the world, only to look completely helpless once Khabib gets his hands on you. He wouldn't just take opponents down, he would tell them exactly what he was going to do to them, do it anyway, and then talk to them while doing it. During his fight with Michael Johnson, he literally told him to give up while throwing punches at him, saying, "You have to give up, I need to fight for the title, you know this." The scariest part? His training methods. Growing up in Dagestan, he would wrestle bears as a child. Yes, you heard that right. Actual bears. His father's training regime was so intense that UFC champion Daniel Cormier once said Khabib's regular training days were harder than most fighters' competition days. When you're raised wrestling bears in the mountains of Dagestan, cage fighting probably feels like a relaxing afternoon. Number 11. Ray Lewis. Some athletes are dangerous because of their physical abilities. Ray Lewis was dangerous because he could smell fear. For 17 seasons in the NFL, this man didn't just play linebacker, he hunted quarterbacks like they owed him money. The Ravens' defense under his leadership wasn't just the best in the league, it was psychological warfare in shoulder pads. The numbers are frightening enough: 13 Pro Bowls, 2,059 tackles, and a defense that still holds the record for fewest points allowed in a 16-game season. But numbers don't tell you about the fear in a running back's eyes when they heard Lewis screaming across the field. They don't tell you about quarterbacks changing their plays just because they saw him adjusting his position. What made Lewis truly terrifying was his preparation. He would study game film until he could predict plays before they happened. Opposing teams would change their entire game plans just to avoid him, only to find him right there anyway, like he was reading their minds. Former NFL players still talk about how he would call out their plays before they ran them, making them feel like they were playing against a demon who could see the future. Number 10. Ronnie Coleman. Now you might be wondering what a bodybuilder is doing on this list, but Ronnie Coleman wasn't just any bodybuilder. He was a force of nature that rewrote what we thought was humanly possible. 8 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles only tell part of the story. What made Coleman dangerous wasn't just his size, it was the inhuman weights he would throw around like they were made of plastic. Picture this: most people celebrate when they can squat 405 pounds once. Coleman would do it for reps while yelling, "Lightweight baby." He would deadlift 800 pounds, not in a powerlifting competition, but as part of his regular training. And he did this while maintaining a physique that looked like it was carved from granite. The truly dangerous part? The intensity he brought to every single workout. While other bodybuilders would carefully plan their training to avoid overtraining, Coleman would train the same body part multiple times a week with weights that would cripple normal humans. He once famously said, "Everybody wants to be a bodybuilder, but don't nobody want to lift no heavy-ass weight." His training videos became legendary, not just for the weights he lifted, but for the primal screams that would echo through the gym as he pushed himself beyond what anyone thought possible. The price he paid for this intensity? Multiple surgeries, including several spinal operations. But even after the surgeries, even after doctors told him to stop, he kept training. Because that's what made him dangerous. Not just his strength, but his absolute refusal to acknowledge human limitations. Number 9. Wayne, the Great One, Gretzky. Now you might be thinking, a hockey player who wasn't known for fighting? But here's the thing about Wayne Gretzky. He was dangerous in a way that transformed the entire sport. While other players were throwing punches, Gretzky was rewiring everyone's brains about what was possible on ice. He didn't need to hurt you physically. He'd destroy you by making you look like you'd never played hockey before. Consider this. Gretzky has more assists than any other player has total points. Let that sink in. If you erased every single goal he ever scored, he'd still be the NHL's all-time points leader. He was so dominant that teams would assign 2 players just to follow him around, and he'd still find ways to score. They literally had to change the rules of hockey because of him, creating the Gretzky rule, where a player couldn't make certain passes to prevent him from being too dominant. But what made Gretzky truly dangerous was his ability to see the future. Not literally, of course, but he played the game like he had a live feed of what was going to happen 5 seconds ahead of everyone else. He'd make passes to empty spots on the ice, and teammates would arrive just in time to score. Opposition players would watch game tape of him for hours, thinking they'd figured him out, only to find themselves looking foolish when he'd do something nobody had ever seen before. Number 8. Bruce Lee. We're not just talking about a martial artist here. We're talking about someone who revolutionized the entire concept of fighting. Bruce Lee wasn't dangerous because he was the biggest or strongest. He was dangerous because he turned combat into a science, then rewrote all the rules. His punching power was so explosive that he had to slow down his movements for cameras to capture them properly. Lee's famous 1-inch punch wasn't just some party trick. It was a demonstration of power so concentrated that it could send a 200-pound man flying backward from just 1 inch away. He developed his own martial art, Jeet Kune Do, because traditional styles weren't efficient enough for him. Think about that. This man looked at thousands of years of martial arts development and said, "I can make this better." The truly terrifying part about Lee wasn't his physical abilities, though they were superhuman. It was his obsession with perfection. He would practice the same move thousands of times, not until he got it right, but until he couldn't get it wrong. His training routines were so intense that other martial artists would try them and give up within days. He was known to kick heavy bags so hard that he'd send them crashing through walls. And while everyone was focused on his lightning-fast strikes, he was busy studying everything from Western boxing to fencing to create the perfect fighting system. Number 7. Fedor Emelianenko. In the wild world of heavyweight MMA, where one punch can end everything, Fedor Emelianenko moved like a lightweight, but hit like a truck. For nearly a decade, this quiet Russian dominated the most dangerous division in the most dangerous sport, with all the emotional expression of someone waiting for a bus. They called him the Last Emperor, but that doesn't begin to capture what made him so terrifying. During his prime, Fedor went undefeated for 28 fights straight, beating monsters who outweighed him by 50, 60, sometimes even 100 pounds. But it wasn't just that he won, it was how he won. He'd walk through punches that would knock out normal humans, showing zero reaction, then respond with combinations that looked impossibly fast for a heavyweight. His ground game was just as scary. He'd catch submission artists in their own favorite moves. What made Fedor truly dangerous was his complete lack of telltales. Most fighters show some sign of what they're about to do, a slight tension, a shift in stance. But Fedor? He'd have the same blank expression whether he was about to throw a fight-ending combination or tie his shoes. He approached fighting like a mathematician solving an equation, except his solutions involved putting people to sleep. In a sport full of emotional athletes who'd pump themselves up before fights, Fedor's calmness was scarier than any war cry. Number 6. Bo Jackson. There's being a great athlete, and then there's Bo Jackson, a man who made other professional athletes look like they were playing a different sport entirely. We're talking about someone who would hit a home run, then casually snap a baseball bat over his knee like it was a toothpick. The same person who'd run full speed into a wall, and the wall would lose. The stories about Bo sound like myths, but they actually happened. He'd run so fast that he'd overrun his own highlights, disappearing from the TV frame. He threw a baseball from the warning track to home plate on a fly, not once, but regularly. He ran up walls in the outfield, literally ran up them to make catches. NFL Hall of Famer Marcus Allen once said that Bo was the only player he ever saw who could have gone into the Hall of Fame in 2 sports. But what made Bo truly dangerous wasn't just his superhuman abilities. It was how effortless he made it all look. He treated professional sports like a hobby, playing baseball for fun while being an NFL star. He'd crush a 450-foot home run, then shrug it off like he was playing catch in the backyard. Even his career-ending hip injury became legendary. He popped his hip out of socket during a tackle, then casually popped it back in and walked off the field. Think about that. An injury that would have most people screaming in agony, and Bo treated it like a minor inconvenience. Number 5. Anderson Silva. In his prime, Anderson Silva didn't just beat opponents. He made them question whether they should ever fight again. For 7 years and 16 straight fights, Silva turned the UFC's middleweight division into his personal highlight reel. But describing him as just a fighter doesn't capture what made him so dangerous. He was more like a glitch in the Matrix, someone who could bend the rules of what we thought was physically possible. Silva would drop his hands, lean back at impossible angles, and make world-class strikers miss by millimeters before countering with precision that seemed almost cruel. He'd switch stances mid-combination, throw kicks that looked like they defied physics, and end fights with moves that looked like they belonged in a kung fu movie. During his legendary fight with Forrest Griffin, he dodged punches with his hands down, moving his head like he was in a slow-motion scene, while Griffin was fighting at normal speed. The truly terrifying part about Silva wasn't just his skill. It was his psychological warfare. He'd play with opponents, taunting them, letting them think they had a chance, only to flip a switch and end the fight in spectacular fashion. He knocked out Vitor Belfort with a front kick to the face, a move straight out of The Karate Kid that nobody thought would work in real fighting. In a sport where being half a second too slow means getting knocked out, Silva made it look like he was always 3 steps ahead. Number 4. Lawrence Taylor. The NFL had never seen anything like Lawrence Taylor, and it hasn't seen anything like him since. They called him LT, but they could have called him the Grim Reaper because he changed the way quarterbacks slept at night. This wasn't just a linebacker. This was a force of nature that made the most dangerous sport in the world even more dangerous. Before LT, offensive linemen could prepare for what was coming, but Taylor moved like a 250-pound cat, equally capable of running around you, through you, or over you. He ended Joe Theismann's career with a sack so violent that they won't show the replay on TV anymore. But here's the truly scary part. That wasn't even his most devastating hit. He played with such ferocity that teams had to completely change how they approached the game. The left tackle position, now one of the highest paid in football, became crucial simply because teams needed someone who might have a chance of slowing him down. What made Taylor truly dangerous wasn't just his physical gifts or his technique, it was his mentality. He approached every play like it was his last, with a relentless intensity that bordered on madness. His own teammates were scared to practice against him because he didn't know how to dial it back. Bill Belichick, who coached Taylor with the Giants, said he changed the way defense was played forever. In a league full of giants, Taylor was the monster that kept them awake at night. Number 3. George Foreman. If you think the young fighters of today are scary, let me tell you about Big George Foreman in his prime. We're talking about a man so terrifying that Muhammad Ali, yes, the Muhammad Ali, had to invent an entirely new strategy just to survive against him. The term puncher's chance didn't apply to Foreman because he didn't need a chance, he just needed one punch. In his prime, Foreman didn't just hit hard, he hit with the kind of power that made other heavyweight champions look like amateurs. Joe Frazier, who'd gone 15 rounds with Muhammad Ali, got knocked down 6 times in 2 rounds by Foreman. Not just knocked down, lifted off his feet and thrown around the ring like a rag doll. Ken Norton, another heavyweight champion, lasted less than 2 rounds. These weren't just fights. They were demonstrations of destructive force that hadn't been seen before or since. But what made Foreman truly dangerous was the psychological impact of his power. Most heavyweight champions would study their opponent's weaknesses. Foreman didn't bother. He'd simply walk through their punches like they weren't there, then throw shots that could dent a car. His trainers said he'd break heavy bags in training. Not just knock them around, but break them. In the ring, he'd often look bored while destroying world-class fighters, like a lion batting around its prey before the inevitable finish. Number 2. Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq wasn't just a basketball player. He was a force of nature that forced the NBA to change its entire structure. Imagine a 7'1" 325-pound athlete who moved like a point guard and could jump like a wide receiver. The NBA had to reinforce their backboards and change their support systems because Shaq kept breaking them. Not occasionally, regularly. He broke the entire support structure, holding up the backboard 3 times in his first season alone. What made Shaq truly dangerous wasn't just his size or strength. It was the combination of raw power and startling athleticism that seemed impossible for someone his size. He'd spin around defenders like a ballet dancer, then dunk with so much force that the entire basket had to be checked for structural damage. Teams would send 3 or 4 players to stop him, and he'd still score like he was playing against children. The Hack-a-Shaq strategy was invented because teams literally couldn't think of any other way to stop him. They'd rather foul him repeatedly than let him get anywhere near the basket. The NBA had to change its rules and reinforce its equipment because of Shaq. Teams had to hire players specifically to try to deal with him. Players who'd never see the court against anyone else. He wasn't just dominant. He was an evolutionary leap in basketball that the sport wasn't physically prepared to handle. When asked about his style of play, Shaq simply said, "I'm going to make them remember me forever." Mission accomplished. Number 1. Mike Tyson. In the history of sports, there has never been anyone who inspired pure primal fear quite like Mike Tyson in his prime. This wasn't just a boxer. This was a force of destruction so terrifying that fighters were losing battles before they even stepped into the ring. Professional heavyweights, men who fought for a living, would literally have physical reactions when they knew they had to face Tyson. Some would make excuses to avoid fighting him. Others would freeze in the ring, their entire fighting style abandoned in the face of what seemed like inevitable destruction. The numbers are staggering. 37 wins in his first 37 fights, 33 by knockout. But numbers don't tell you about the pure intimidation factor. Tyson would walk into the ring wearing just black shorts and no robe, looking like a gladiator ready for war. He'd pace back and forth like a caged animal, never taking his eyes off his opponent. Before the fight even started, you could see some opponents already breaking mentally. What made Tyson the most dangerous athlete of all time wasn't just his devastating power or his lightning speed. It was the absolute certainty of violence he brought into the ring. He wasn't there to outpoint you or win a decision. His intention, as he famously said, was to drive your nosebone into your brain. He fought with a combination of technical brilliance and savage intensity that the sport had never seen before. His trainer, Cus D'Amato, didn't just teach him to box, he molded him into what he called the perfect weapon. In his prime, Tyson's fights weren't really fights, they were events. The question wasn't if he would knock his opponent out, but in which round and how spectacularly. He knocked out Michael Spinks, an undefeated champion, in 91 seconds. Spinks was so traumatized he never fought again. Trevor Berbick, who had gone the distance with Muhammad Ali, lasted less than 2 rounds. The way Tyson dismantled these elite fighters wasn't just impressive, it was scary. Even decades after his prime, videos of Tyson's fights look like something from a different sport entirely. The speed, the power, the precision, and above all, the raw, predatory intensity. There had never been anything like it before, and there hasn't been since. Mike Tyson wasn't just the most dangerous athlete ever. He was a phenomenon that transcended sports, becoming a symbol of pure, unstoppable force.